You are completely soaked. Come on.
I'm just glad I got here.
Please, come inside.
Marcus Ellison owned the 40-story tower downtown, the one whose glass caught the sunset every evening and turned the whole skyline gold for about 6 minutes before the light moved on to somebody else's building. Tonight, though, he wasn't standing anywhere near it. He was 3 miles south, outside a narrow walk-up apartment with a busted porch light, holding a paper bag of ginger chicken that had gone lukewarm somewhere around his second wrong turn. His bike chain had slipped twice on the ride over, and he'd had to stop under an overpass to fix it with hands that hadn't done manual labor in over a decade, not since business school, not since before the first million turned into the first billion and made the idea of manual labor feel like a costume he could put on and take off whenever he wanted. Nobody buzzing him through a service entrance tonight would have believed that 3 miles north, his name was etched into a cornerstone in gold lettering, or that the freight company whose trucks rumbled past this very street every morning belonged, in its entirety, to the man currently soaked through his hoodie and squinting at an apartment number through the rain. He hadn't planned any of this. 6 months ago, in the wreckage of a divorce settlement that had made headlines for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with numbers, his daughter Zoe had looked up at him over a bowl of cereal and asked, with the terrifying honesty only a 7-year-old could manage, whether people only liked them because of the money. He hadn't had a good answer. He still didn't. What he had instead was a fake ID he'd paid too much for through a guy his old college roommate knew, a rotation of odd jobs nobody would ever trace back to a boardroom, and a battered 10-speed he kept in a storage unit 2 neighborhoods from his actual house. Delivery work let him disappear in a way that money never had. It let him be nobody. Just a guy on a bike getting somebody's dinner to their door 15 minutes later than the app promised, and disappearing, lately, had started to feel less like hiding and more like relief. The door opened before he could knock a second time, and a woman stood in the frame wearing a faded Charlotte Hornets sweatshirt with a hole starting at one elbow, sweatpants dusted with what looked like dried glitter glue, and an expression that suggested she'd had a long day, and this bag of chicken was the highlight of it. She reached for the bag, then stopped with her hand still extended, taking him in, the soaked hoodie, the water dripping off the brim of his cap, the way he was shivering slightly without seeming to notice. "You're soaked," she said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't pity either, just a flat statement of fact, delivered the way you tell someone their shoe was untied. She disappeared back into the apartment before he could respond, and came back less than a minute later with a folded bath towel still warm from the dryer and a small to-go container that clearly hadn't come from any delivery app, something homemade, something with rice and vegetables steaming faintly in the cold air between them. "Eat something warm before you get back on that bike. It's supposed to keep raining till midnight." Marcus stood on the top step a second too long, running the calculations he always ran now out of habit, waiting for the ask that came after every unexpected kindness in his adult life, the favor, the connection, the "since you're already here." But Everly Shaw just shrugged like the gesture had cost her nothing at all, told him to keep the towel, and shut the door gently before he could even get her name out. He rode 2 blocks before his hands started shaking too badly to keep steering straight, and he had to pull over and sit down hard on a curb outside a shuttered laundromat, the container of rice balanced in his lap, and admit to himself that it wasn't the cold making him shake. It was something he hadn't let himself feel in longer than he wanted to count. If you've ever had a stranger's small kindness catch you completely off guard, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from tonight. This story's about to show you exactly why that moment mattered more than either of them knew. He told himself, the first few times, that it was purely practical. Her building sat almost exactly on his usual delivery loop, a straight shot from the restaurant district to the residential blocks south of downtown, and the tips on her orders were consistently decent, nothing extravagant, but enough to make the detour worth logging. That was the story he told himself while standing on her doorstep for the 3rd time in 10 days, holding an order he hadn't actually checked twice to confirm it was hers before accepting the job, because some part of him had already recognized her address in the app before his conscious mind caught up to what he was doing. "You again," Everly said, opening the door with a dish towel still slung over one shoulder, and there was something warmer underneath the surprise in her voice than either of them was ready to name out loud. She'd started leaving her porch light on a little later into the evening than she strictly needed to, an adjustment so small she probably hadn't admitted it to herself yet. But Marcus noticed, the way he'd started noticing everything about the 15 minutes he spent standing at the bottom of her steps. He started taking the long way past her street even on nights he wasn't scheduled to work at all, telling himself it was for the exercise, telling himself a lot of things that were technically true and completely beside the point. Small talk turned into real talk faster than either of them expected. She told him, over the course of several doorstep conversations stretched out longer than any delivery justified, about a job at a daycare 3 neighborhoods over. Long hours, harder pay, kids who called her Miss Everly and meant it with their whole small hearts. He told her, in careful, edited pieces, about an apartment that didn't exist, a job history stitched together out of half-truths, a life built entirely around not being recognized. Neither of them said the quiet part, that describing a life made of lies to a stranger on a doorstep had somehow become the truest conversation either of them had all week, truer than boardrooms, truer than the daycare's break room, truer than anything either of them said inside the walls of their actual, real, complicated lives. At home, Zoe noticed the shift in her father before he consciously registered it himself. "You're humming," she said one morning, deeply suspicious, standing in the kitchen doorway in mismatched socks with the particular wariness only a 7-year-old could bring to the subject of her father's unexpected happiness. Marcus didn't have an explanation that wouldn't require unpacking 6 months of careful lying, so he just slid a plate of pancakes across the counter and let her watch him not deny it, which was, in its own way, an answer. She ate her breakfast slowly, watching him hum while he packed her lunch, and didn't ask again, though he could tell she was filing the information away for later. He didn't tell her about Everly. He didn't tell Everly about Zoe either, not the real version, not yet, though he'd caught himself twice starting to and stopping. But something in him had begun rearranging itself around Thursday evenings, around the particular quality of light through her porch window, around the 15 minutes he now protected on his schedule like they were sacred, and he was slowly, reluctantly starting to understand that whatever wall he'd built to protect himself from exactly this kind of feeling had a crack in it now. Wide enough that something was getting through whether he'd given it permission or not. If you know what it's like to protect your heart so carefully that you almost miss it opening back up, hit subscribe, because this story is only getting started. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon from Zoe's after-school program, a brief, apologetic message about a scheduling conflict that meant pickup would need to happen at the community center instead of the usual building, where a rotating cast of part-time staff helped run the after-school hours for families across 3 neighborhoods. Marcus left the office earlier than he'd planned, driving his actual car for once, wearing his actual clothes, the tailored version of himself that Zoe's world had always known, the one with the name that opened doors and closed deals, nothing like the soaked hoodie and busted bike chain of his Thursday evenings. He walked through the community center's glass doors expecting nothing more complicated than a mildly annoying detour in his afternoon. He nearly dropped his keys when he saw her. Everly was kneeling on a carpet patterned with faded alphabet letters, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, hair pulled back in a way he hadn't seen before, helping a cluster of 6- and 7-year-olds construct something ambitious and structurally unsound out of foam blocks. She hadn't noticed him yet, fully absorbed in whatever engineering crisis the block tower was currently facing, completely unaware that 10 feet away, the man from her doorstep was standing frozen in the entrance, trying to reconcile 2 versions of a woman he thought he understood. "Miss Everly!" Zoe's voice cut through the noise of the room before Marcus could gather himself, and his daughter was already running across the carpet, wrapping her arms around Everly's waist with the total, unguarded affection of a child who has decided someone belongs to her. "This is my dad." Everly looked up at the introduction, and Marcus watched her face perform the exact same impossible arithmetic his own face must have been doing, recognition crashing into confusion, 2 entirely separate compartments of her life suddenly, violently occupying the same fluorescent-lit room, the same 10 square feet of carpet scattered with foam blocks. Neither of them said the sentence sitting behind both their eyes, "I know you. Not from here. Not like this." The silence stretched half a second too long before either of them managed to cover it. "Small city," Everly finally said, recovering first, her voice landing somewhere between a laugh and a warning. Marcus matched her tone as best he could, mumbling something equally useless about coincidences and small world moments, while internally recalculating everything he thought he knew about the woman who left her porch light on for him. Zoe, blessedly oblivious to the tectonic shift happening over her head, spent the entire car ride home cataloging everything wonderful about Miss Everly in exhaustive, joyful detail. How she always saved Zoe the good glitter before the other kids could claim it, how she noticed Zoe go quiet on the anniversary of the divorce being finalized and hadn't asked why. Had simply sat beside her on the reading rug until the quiet passed on its own. Marcus gripped the steering wheel and said very little, turning the day over and over, because the woman his daughter had somehow already claimed as hers was the exact same woman leaving a light on for a man she believed delivered food for a living, and he could no longer tell whether that discovery made the lie between them feel unforgivable or, for the first time and longer than he wanted to admit, dangerously, hopefully real. If a small coincidence has ever completely rearranged how you saw someone, comment below and let us know, because this story is about to get a lot more complicated. He almost told her the following Thursday. Stood there on the top step with the words already halfway up his throat, rehearsed a dozen times on the ride over until they'd started to sound almost natural, and then Everly mentioned, offhand, that her manager had cut her hours again this month, and the entire confession folded itself back up and disappeared into his chest before he could get it out. He hated himself a little for the relief he felt when the moment passed. It would have been so simple to say it, "I'm not who you think I am, and neither, apparently, are you," but simple had never once been part of how either of them operated, not for 6 months, not for longer than that if he was honest about the pattern of his whole adult life. They'd started talking past the doorway entirely now, conversations stretching 20-30 minutes into the evening, Everly sitting on the top step with her knees pulled up to her chest, Marcus leaning against the porch railing in the position that had become, without either of them naming it, theirs. She told him, in a quieter voice than usual one night, about a father who measured love the way other people measured stock performance, quarterly, conditionally, always with an eye toward return on investment, and how that had left her unable, for most of her adult life, to tell the difference between someone's affection and someone's angle. That was part of why she'd built this apartment, this job, this entire smaller version of her life, because nobody could buy their way into wanting her here. Marcus sat with that for a long moment before admitting he recognized the exact shape of that wound, because he was wearing an almost identical one himself, just stitched from different fabric. He nearly slipped once, badly. They'd walked together to a corner store 2 blocks from her apartment, some errand neither of them fully remembered inventing later, and at the register he'd reached for his wallet without thinking and pulled out the wrong card first, sleek black, the kind that didn't ask questions at any register in the city, before catching himself and shoving it back, fumbling for the beaten ordinary debit card he kept specifically for moments exactly like this one. Everly's eyes had flicked toward the black card for maybe half a second, no longer, before he covered it with a laugh about it being the end of the month and everything being a mess. She hadn't pushed, hadn't asked, had simply let the moment pass with an ease that made him wonder, walking home afterward, whether that was genuine grace or whether some part of her already suspected more than she was letting on. Zoe asked to see Miss Everly again before the week was even over, bringing it up unprompted at dinner, at bath time, at the particular hour before bed when she always negotiated hardest for things she wanted. Marcus found himself agreeing before he'd fully thought it through, arranging what he told himself was a coincidental meet-up at the park 2 blocks from Zoe's school, watching from a bench as Everly pushed his daughter on the swings, both of them laughing at something he couldn't hear from that distance, and understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that whatever this disguise had originally been built to protect him from, it had never once accounted for the possibility of actually falling for someone while wearing it. If you're rooting for these two as hard as we are right now, smash that like button. You're not ready for what happens next. The meeting had been sitting on his calendar for weeks, circled in a color his assistant used specifically for deals that mattered, the kind of appointment nobody moved without a very good reason. Ellison Logistics was finalizing a lease and freight partnership with the Shaw Hospitality Group, a deal his team had been chasing across 2 full fiscal quarters, negotiations that had crawled through lawyers and counteroffers and one nearly catastrophic disagreement over warehouse access rights before finally arriving at a signing. Marcus walked into the glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, papers already laid out in careful stacks, his legal team already seated and reviewing final language, feeling, for once, entirely in control of the room and everything happening inside it. Everly walked in from the opposite door exactly 4 minutes later, in a blazer he had never once seen her wear, her hair down instead of pulled back the way it always was at the daycare, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm like armor. She stopped mid-step the moment she saw him seated at the head of the table, and Marcus watched something shift violently behind her eyes as 6 months of doorstep conversations rearranged themselves in real time into an entirely different shape. "You're Ellison," she said, and it wasn't phrased as a question. It was the sound of every Thursday evening, every folded towel, every half-truth they'd traded on her front steps suddenly recontextualizing itself into something almost unrecognizable. "You're a Shaw," Marcus said back, matching her disbelief, and the room went quiet enough that he could hear the air conditioning cycle on somewhere in the ceiling, a low mechanical hum filling the space where conversation should have been. Neither of them sat down right away. The lawyers on both sides exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether they'd walked into a business dispute or something else entirely, something none of their training had prepared them to navigate. Somewhere beneath the shock, Marcus registered the sheer absurdity of the moment. 2 people who had spent months trading real food and real conversation on a rain-soaked doorstep, who had built something quiet and unguarded out of 2 carefully maintained lies, now standing across a conference table stacked with contracts bearing both their real, full, unmistakable names. Everly's hand had gone still on the back of her chair, knuckles pale against the leather, like she was steadying herself against a version of him she'd never once suspected existed underneath the hoodie and the busted bike chain. "We should reschedule," one of the junior associates finally offered into the silence, in the careful voice of someone hoping to defuse a situation they didn't fully understand. Nobody moved. Marcus and Everly simply stood there, staring at each other across a table built entirely out of the things they'd each spent months hiding, both of them finally, completely seen in a way neither had planned for, and neither one certain yet whether that felt like disaster or the first honest relief either of them had experienced in years. Have you ever had the truth catch up with you in the last place you expected? Tell us about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because this confrontation is about to get real. They ended up in the empty hallway outside the conference room 15 minutes later, the door pulled shut behind them, both legal teams left to sort through the wreckage of a meeting that had derailed entirely, voices low but sharp enough to cut through the hallway's polished quiet. "You lied to me," Everly said first, arms crossed tight over the blazer she'd never once worn on her actual doorstep, more hurt threaded through her voice than anger, though there was plenty of that too. "Every Thursday. Every single conversation on those steps. You let me think you were struggling, let me hand you food like you actually needed it, let me feel like I'd found someone who—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, jaw tight, eyes bright with something she was clearly working hard not to let fall. "I let you think exactly what you let me think," Marcus said back, quieter than her, but no less firm. "You had a whole apartment set up, a whole job, a whole daycare's worth of kids calling you Miss Everly, a life built specifically to keep people like me at arm's length. You don't get to be the only one in this hallway who was scared of being wanted for the wrong reason." That landed. She looked away first, toward the window at the end of the hall, toward the skyline where both their family names were quietly, permanently stitched into different buildings a few blocks apart, close enough that they'd probably passed each other in cars 100 times without ever knowing it. "My father taught me that anyone who says they love you is quietly doing math on what they'll get out of it," she said finally, her voice dropping into something rawer than the anger from a minute earlier. "Every boyfriend, every friend, every person who ever got close enough, I spent my whole life waiting for the moment they showed me their calculator. I just wanted 5 minutes, once, where nobody was doing math. where somebody wanted to talk to me because of something that had nothing to do with what I could give them. My ex-wife taught me the same lesson, just with better lawyers and a more expensive settlement," Marcus said, something in his chest finally loosening as he said it out loud for the first time to anyone besides his own daughter. "I built this whole fake life so Zoe wouldn't grow up learning the same thing I did, that people can look at you and only see numbers. And then you opened your door with a towel and a plate of food you didn't have to give me, and asked for nothing back, and I genuinely did not know what to do with a stranger who wanted nothing from me." They stood there in that hallway for a long stretch of silence, both of them quietly recalculating every doorstep, every near slip, every unguarded moment they'd each privately decided the other one felt different, safer, realer, more honest than anyone else in either of their overfull, overwatched, overexamined lives. "We built the exact same cage," Everly said eventually, something in her voice finally breaking open all the way, no longer guarded. "Just to see if anyone out there would love us enough to climb through the bars and find us anyway." Marcus didn't have a clever answer ready for that, didn't try to find one. He just reached for her hand across the space between them, and this time, for the first time since either of them had started lying, either one pulled away. If you've ever built walls to protect yourself from being loved for the wrong reasons, let us know in the comments, and subscribe, because the ending they earned is coming up next. They ended up in the empty hallway outside the conference room 15 minutes later, the door pulled shut behind them, both legal teams left to sort through the wreckage of a meeting that had derailed entirely, voices low but sharp enough to cut through the hallway's polished quiet. "You lied to me," Everly said first, arms crossed tight over the blazer she'd never once worn on her actual doorstep, more hurt threaded through her voice than anger, though there was plenty of that too. "Every Thursday. Every single conversation on those steps. You let me think you were struggling, let me hand you food like you actually needed it, let me feel like I'd found someone who—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, jaw tight, eyes bright with something she was clearly working hard not to let fall. "I let you think exactly what you let me think," Marcus said back, quieter than her, but no less firm. "You had a whole apartment set up, a whole job, a whole daycare's worth of kids calling you Miss Everly, a life built specifically to keep people like me at arm's length. You don't get to be the only one in this hallway who was scared of being wanted for the wrong reason." That landed. She looked away first, toward the window at the end of the hall, toward the skyline where both their family names were quietly, permanently stitched into different buildings a few blocks apart, close enough that they'd probably passed each other in cars 100 times without ever knowing it. "My father taught me that anyone who says they love you is quietly doing math on what they'll get out of it," she said finally, her voice dropping into something rawer than the anger from a minute earlier. "Every boyfriend, every friend, every person who ever got close enough, I spent my whole life waiting for the moment they showed me their calculator. I just wanted 5 minutes, once, where nobody was doing math. Where somebody wanted to talk to me because of something that had nothing to do with what I could give them. My ex-wife taught me the same lesson, just with better lawyers and a more expensive settlement," Marcus said, something in his chest finally loosening as he said it out loud for the first time to anyone besides his own daughter. "I built this whole fake life so Zoe wouldn't grow up learning the same thing I did, that people can look at you and only see numbers. And then you opened your door with a towel and a plate of food you didn't have to give me, and asked for nothing back, and I genuinely did not know what to do with a stranger who wanted nothing from me." They stood there in that hallway for a long stretch of silence, both of them quietly recalculating every doorstep, every near slip, every unguarded moment they'd each privately decided the other one felt different, safer, realer, more honest than anyone else in either of their overfull, overwatched, overexamined lives. "We built the exact same cage," Everly said eventually, something in her voice finally breaking open all the way, no longer guarded. "Just to see if anyone out there would love us enough to climb through the bars and find us anyway." Marcus didn't have a clever answer ready for that, didn't try to find one. He just reached for her hand across the space between them, and this time, for the first time since either of them had started lying, either one pulled away. If you've ever built walls to protect yourself from being loved for the wrong reasons, let us know in the comments, and subscribe, Because the ending they earned is coming up next.